Welcome to the book club where the size is just right, the books aren't too long, and you never need to host. That's our job. We bring best-selling and award-winning writers of every genre to Twin Cities metro area libraries to share their stories, discuss their work, and answer those burning questions you've always wanted to ask your favorite authors. This is a book club where we don't have to argue about what the author meant. They can tell us. The book club that doesn't require a clean house or wine and cheese. And in this book club, if you haven't read the book, it's all right. Although, we hope you'll be inspired to pick it up next time you're in the library. I'm your host, Slade Kemet, and you can consider the book club rewritten because this is Club Book. Club Book is made possible by Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, MELSA, and Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. We would also like to thank our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. This podcast features Yangsze Choo at Scott County Library, Savage. Yangsze Choo is the author behind some of this decade's most original historical fantasy. Her work is often inspired by folklore and infused with the paranormal. Such is the case for her 2013 debut, The Ghost Bride. Publishers Weekly praised, Choo's clear and charming style creates an alternate reality where the stakes are just as high as in the real world, combining grounded period storytelling with the supernatural. The Ghost Bride is the basis for Netflix's acclaimed Taiwanese-Malaysian drama of the same name. Choo's follow-up, The Night Tiger, is set in 1930s colonial Malaysia. In it, apprentice dressmaker Ji Lin and orphan boy Ren become tangled in a mystery involving weretigers, terrifying beasts who wear the skin of humans. Reese Witherspoon selected The Night Tiger as the April 2019 pick for her popular Reese's Book Club. Shapeshifters of a different kind loom large in Choo's latest release, The Foxwife. In a glowing review, Time recommended the book as an enchanting tale of murder, revenge, and the power of a mother's love.
Hello, and thank you very much. It is my first time in Minnesota, and I have to say that it is just beautiful. It is also a lot cooler than California. Some of you might have heard about our heat wave, and when I flew out, it was 105 degrees. So I actually did not bring autumn clothing, and this morning I decided to try to be a real Minnesotan, and I bought myself a flannel shirt, which I was going to wear tonight, and I thought, oh no, okay. But I love it, and I'm actually loving Minnesota. So thank you again for having me, and thank you, Club Book. Well, today I'm going to talk to you about my newest novel, The Foxwife, which means we'll talk about foxes. And afterwards we'll have a question and answer, and I'm very happy to answer all your burning questions. I am also an avid reader myself, and so whenever I go to literary festivals and book events, I'm always queuing up at other authors' booths and saying things like, will you sign my book? And why did this happen in chapter 5? So I totally understand the heart of a reader, and so afterwards, we can take a free form Q&A. I can answer your burning questions about the books or about other things like audiobooks. For example, I read all 3 of my audiobooks, and I'm bad about mentioning this, but my publisher says I should tell people. But The Night Tiger was actually a finalist for an Audio Award, which is sort of like the Emmys of the audiobook world. Thanks. Well, like I said, I just never really feel comfortable talking about this. My publisher's like, go and tell people, for goodness sake. So I'm happy to talk about audiobooks and about publishing, about writing novels. But first, let's start with foxes. So, this book is about foxes. Not the regular sort of animal, but the shapeshifters of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese literature who can turn themselves into beautiful women and handsome men. I don't know if any of you have heard of this legend before. Have you? You can wave your hand. Yes, oh my. Okay, great. Wily tricksters, they will steal your heart, as well as any money or gold wine cups that you happen to have lying around. So when I was a child, I read a lot of stories by Paul Song-ling, a Qing dynasty scholar. He actually did very badly in the imperial exams and he never got an official title. What he is famous for, however, is compiling a book of 500 strange tales concerning ghosts, the afterlife, and of course, foxes. And these were written as supposed histories. So for example, in such and such a year in a certain town, this happened. And it was like the twilight zone of 17th century China. And as a child, I was fascinated by these stories, particularly the ones about foxes. And so when I told my editor that I was writing a book about foxes, she actually said, "Please don't tell me that this is about talking animals." And I had to reassure her that no, this is not like Watership Down. The foxes look like people. And since I was also raised on a steady diet of Agatha Christie and P.D. James, I couldn't help but turn it into a detective novel as well. So I must confess here that I don't plan out my books, and this is to my own detriment. If only I were more organised, I often think, I'd be far less prone to staring out of the window instead of writing, wondering if that squirrel will manage to jump from the cherry tree to my fence. And the image, though, of that squirrel leaping precariously is similar to how I begin writing a novel. I'm struck by an idea, and like a squirrel, I leap towards the unknown. I know, it's not very dignified, I'm afraid. But when things are going well, I can often write the first chapter in 1 or 2 sittings, and the opening scene unfolding rapidly, so I'm rushing to write it down. Sometimes in the middle of working on something completely different, and that is what happened with The Foxwife. So I was actually finishing up my second novel, The Night Tiger. Ooh, is this better? Okay, I'm going to hold it like this. So I was finishing up The Night Tiger when I happened to think about the stories about shape-shifting foxes that I had read as a child. And I noticed that they tended to follow a certain pattern. And so I wrote down the first sentence of this book, precisely as it appears. Perhaps you know this story. And in fact, I'm now going to read the first page of the novel. Manchuria, 1908. Perhaps you know this story. Late one evening, a beautiful woman comes knocking on an unsuspecting scholar's door. "Who is it?" the young man asks, peering out into the neglected garden where flowers and shrubs bend into strange shapes in the moonlight. "Let me in." She has a bewitching smile and a jar of his favourite rice wine. And he does, hesitant at first, because he's supposed to be studying for the imperial examinations. Why is she alone outside this remote country villa? And why do her eyes gleam strangely in the rain-wet darkness? But he tells himself, it's all right, she's likely a prostitute sent by his friends as a joke. They drink the wine, one thing leads to another, and despite her blushes and his pile of untouched books, he has one of the most enjoyable evenings he can recall. Except he can't really remember it. The details are misted in lamplight and laughter. But he must see her again. He seizes her hands, such long-fingered, sharp-nailed hands, and won't let her go. "My home is over there," she says, pointing at a curious little hill. "If you follow the road, it's the 4th house from the top." The next night he sets out after his old servant has gone to bed. If he paid attention, he'd see that the road peters out until it's barely a trail through overgrown grass, but he doesn't notice, so besotted is he. There are many curious houses along the way, all with darkened windows like empty sockets. Fine mansions, little hovels. The fourth house from the top of the hill is an imposing mansion. The name on its gate is Hu, or fox. Again and again he visits her, neglecting his studies, while a pile of unopened letters accumulates from his angry parents. His skin shrivels like a withered leaf, his tonsils swell and his spine curves. Finally, the worried old servant brings in a monk to exorcise evil spirits. When the spell is broken, the scholar howls and weeps in humiliated fury, tearing his clothes with trembling hands. A raiding party is made up of local peasants who swear there are no houses or grand estates on that crooked little hill, only a long abandoned graveyard. The fourth grave from the top is constructed as Chinese graves are, like a little house half sunk into the hill. Using hoes and spades, they break into it to discover that it has become a fox's den. So as you see, this is the classic Chinese fox tale. A beautiful woman comes knocking on a scholar's door. He lets her in, they have a passionate affair, and then he discovers that she's not actually human. And this led to all sorts of questions on my end, including what were these creatures up to and why did they always come and interrupt other people's exams? All these stories are, of course, told from the human point of view. But I wondered about the secret lives of foxes, these mysterious supporting characters who come at dusk to meddle in our lives. It is the flip side of the story, the unspoken possibility that knocks on the door, that intrigues me. And so it struck me while I was writing this book that it might be fun to hear this tale told from the fox's point of view. A fox with many opinions who disrupts the traditional account by pointing out that even in the best of times, it isn't easy for someone like me to make a living. And so when I got to this point, I was very amused and decided to keep going. And later, when I'd finished the novel, I realized how prescient that sentence turned out to be, for it isn't easy for anyone to make a living, let alone a fox who lives in the shadows at the edge of civilization and the wilderness. But at this point, as I have to confess to you, I still had no idea where this book was going. And this is a dreadful state of affairs for people who like to outline, such as my husband and various other friends. My husband always says, why don't you make some bullet points? And I always reply, I can't. I might as well just keep writing because I'm discovering the story as it's being written, which was very true. I kept on typing and the fox in my head went on to say, I exist either as a small canid with thick fur, pointed ears and neat black feet, or a young woman. Neither are safe forms in a world run by men. Frankly, I prefer to look like someone's grandmother. That would at least give me some dignity appropriate to my years. Yes, I thought to myself, I've always wondered why fairy tales feature such young girls and foolish yokels, because what could you possibly know when you're 16? I have a 17-year-old at home, so it's they make a lot of decisions which aren't always wise. And that's why they always have grandmothers around in fairy tales to dispense advice and warn you not to do things like don't open the seventh door or don't eat the food of the dead. Useful things like that. And so I thought, in fact, it might be more delightful to hear the adventures of an older person, and in this case, a fox who's several hundred years old, who happens to have the appearance of a sultry young vixen. And so I continued to write from the fox's perspective. Most tales focus on the beautiful female foxes who live by devouring qi, or life force. Little is said about the males. Women who run around willfully doing whatever they please are bound to be censured. A handsome, cunning man is a different matter. Most male foxes are only forced to retire or fake their deaths when their uncanny, ageless looks start to disturb people. Don't get me started on the unfairness of this. I generally avoid males of my own race. Ha ha, I thought. These problems were all very interesting. How indeed did the foxes survive? Why did they meddle with human affairs? And by this point, which was page 2 of the book, I had already decided that this is going to be my next novel. Never mind that I had no idea what was coming next, though it did struck me that the fox in my book had an agenda. Mysteriously. And by this time, my children had come home from school. "Why are you laughing, Mummy?" one of them asked. "Because I'm getting a lot of work done," I said. "But you've only written 2 pages. So I had to explain that it wasn't the quantity, but rather the feeling that those 2 pages inspired in me, and the sensation that I had just placed my foot on a new road that led somewhere possibly exciting. And so my kids nodded and just wandered off, and I continued to type furiously and discovered that my fox lady had rushed ahead and taken a train out of the grasslands of Inner Mongolia. So there is a Chinese belief that ghosts and foxes are particularly active during times of chaos, which for the United States might be about now. And as I wrote, it became clear to me that the book should be set in 1908, or the dying years of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty. It was a time of great uncertainty, after which China would be plunged into revolution and civil war. Northeast China, or Manchuria, was prey to the ambitions of Russia and Japan, as well as local warlords. And as my fox said late in the novel, foxes are naturally drawn to trouble. Some say that's because we are the cause of it, but the truth is that chaos is always interesting and often profitable. So in fact, while writing this novel, I went down quite a few rabbit holes myself. And I wasn't the only one either. In Chinese literature, many famous scholars were obsessed with foxes. And during the Ming and Qing dynasties, from the 1600s onwards, there was a craze for stories about them. So it's a bit like Twilight in the early 2000s, when everyone wanted to read about vampires. So there were actually even a few unusual books which claimed to be written by actual foxes. And so in the rare book collection of the Beijing University Library, there is an incomplete handwritten book called The Journey to the East, or Dong You Ji. The title itself is a play on the famous story, The Monkey King, which is called Xi You Ji, which is The Journey to the West. And the very odd subtitle says, "This book was narrated by the Hu Xian and cautiously collected by the all-happy brothel." So I was like, what is this book? The book itself is written with many unknown Chinese characters and mostly wrong combinations of parts and radicals or misspellings. And since prostitutes used to worship fox spirits, it's possible that this book was written through spirit writing, like via a planchette, or what do you call it? A Ouija board. By courtesans in a brothel, and the wrong characters might be attributed to their lack of education. Or perhaps it was written by actual foxes who couldn't spell. So we don't know. So the physical existence of this strange book echoes how I felt when I was writing The Foxwife. When I began it, the voice of the fox, who is one of the narrators, simply took over and had lots and lots of opinions on everything from appraising antique wine cups to burning down other people's houses. She also tries very hard to be good, which raises the question of what is good to a non-human creature. So Chinese have many different words for foxes. Hu Shen is the fox god, the deity worshipped in shrines, once very common throughout northern China. And then there is Hu Jing, which is the fox spirit, and Hu Xian, which is the immortal or transcendental. So many different kinds of categories for the spirit life. And the word Hu itself, meaning fox, is also a homophone for another name, Hu. And it's pronounced exactly the same, in case you all wondering, did I hear it wrong? It sounds exactly the same. It is a word that was used in the past for barbarians. And so this is super interesting because there are a lot of parallels between stories about foxes and foreigners. So for example, foxes are described as people who aren't really people, but beasts pretending to be human. They're strangely attractive and they smell different, all of which smacks of xenophobia. So the cult of the fox itself is based on a folk religion with shamanistic roots. Foxes were both harvest deities and demons. They were feared and they were also worshipped. The other side of the religion involves fox mediums, or people who claimed to speak for the gods. So such mediums tended to be of low social status, mostly young women. And the reason for this might have been because historically, if you were somebody's daughter-in-law, you would have no say about anything. But if you claimed that you were possessed or a fox was your lover, then people would start to listen to you. The medium would tell fortunes and even mediate social disputes like the boundary lines, like who does this field belong to, etc. However, association with foxes was also disreputable. Calling a woman a fox, even now in China, Japan, and Korea, is an insult. It is not really a compliment, as it implies willfulness, chaos, and promiscuity. From another angle, the stories about foxes are always from a male point of view. It is a scholar who tames the fox woman, often by marrying her and having her bear him sons, who then prove clever enough to do well in the imperial examinations. So I was like, what is it with Chinese people and the examinations? But if we could go on to a long discussion about the civil service and how these kind of widespread nationwide examinations were a merit-based way to make your fortune. But that will be another talk. And it makes you wonder, though, if you were a fox, why would you ever submit to this? And so when I wrote this novel, I thought of how foxes would manage their relationships with people rather than the usual human idea of foxes as pests. And finally, this is a book about love. My favourite Jane Austen novel is Persuasion. I don't know if any of you have read it. Okay, I do see some nods. Because it speaks to old loves and the yearning sensation of what might have been. And so the other narrator of this book is a 63-year-old detective named Bao, and he is searching for his own lost first love. So my husband says that the fox wife, he said, "What, you should go around telling your readers that it is an old people's love story." And I was like, yeah, okay, I like that. It is about the love of your youth, missed opportunities, and the last chance to make up. So there are so many layers of meaning about foxes and their role in our world. As a famous scholar, Ji Lin, said, "Humans and things are different species, and foxes lie between humans and things. Darkness and light take different paths, and foxes lie between darkness and light." The fox wife explores this world of shadows and laughter, weaving together a tale of revenge, redemption, and love. I hope you enjoy it.
With that, we have reached the part of our podcast where we turn to our club book audience for questions and comments for Yangsze Choo and her work. In this book club, we like to encourage members and authors to connect and engage and help bridge the gap between the page you read and the process it took to write it. Our first question of the night comes from an audience member wondering about Choo's research process.
Well, I will say that the most fun part about writing fiction is that your hobbies become research. So when I was writing Night Tiger, I actually had a stack of books on my desk about tigers, man-eating tigers of Malaya, a lot of statistics about the number of people eaten by tigers. For example, most deaths were actually caused by leopards, not tigers. But it turns out that 100 years ago and now, people were much more likely, they'd rather say that so-and-so's eaten by a tiger and not a leopard. Very interesting. And so when my parents came to visit, my mum was like, why are you reading these books? These are not, why don't you read something happy? And I could only tell her, like, I thought it was really interesting. So The Foxwife was another one of these passion projects. I had already read a lot about fox stories as a child, and I also read a number of 18th century sources of actual encounters with foxes. These are supposed encounters, and they were from both China and Japan. And a number of these stories are actually, I put them into the book as when the foxes tell you stories about themselves. Some of them are supposed historical encounters. And the very strange feeling I got from reading these historical documents was they were so disjointed. They were very odd, disjointed tales about meeting people who they felt convinced were foxes, that the very strangeness and disjointedness almost made it feel very true. So perhaps in every age there are inexplicable events that people best try to understand through what they know of the culture and the mores at the time. I think it had happened in the 50s, they might all have been UFO spottings. You know, I was taken away to a room and given strange food. So, you know, so that's part of the research I did. I also, you know, I read a lot of books, and I also went to China. I went to Suzhou, Hangzhou, which are cities in China with garden villas, because a lot of the book takes place in the luxurious historic garden villas of the rich. I love plants myself, so I also spent way too long looking up different plants for the books. And so I went there, and actually, if you read the novel, partway through the book, the characters get on a boat and go to Japan. And they do this because of COVID. So I took one trip to China, and I was going to go back again when COVID hit. And so I spent part of my own childhood in Japan. And so I decided to move the book to a part of Japan, Kitakyushu, which I had been to before. I am a very slow writer, and partway through, I take about 4 years to write each book, and publishers would like a year. Luckily, my literary agent is very patient. She's been like, "Oh, it's you," and when I was about 2 years into this novel, she called me up. She's like, "Where's the book?" And I was like, "Well, I'm still writing it," and it was much too long as well. So, we can talk about that as well. But I tend to write long and then cut. In fact, this novel was almost twice the length it ought to have been. So the cutting of it is always very difficult. But as to how the book goes, it is very hard for me to explain because, I was actually talking to sometimes I talk to kids at school, and people always ask me, like, how do you write books? And I tell them all, you should write an outline. All of you need to write outlines, especially for your history papers. But they're like, but you don't seem to. And I really don't know why it doesn't work like that for me. I have many author friends who do use outlines. I went to visit one of my friends recently. She had a big whiteboard up and a lot of post-it notes. So she was actually moving things like chapter 1, chapter 2, so she could actually do things in a very reasonable way. And I really admired her for that. But I think the best way to describe it for me is that when I'm writing, it feels like I'm listening to music. And so you have a feeling like, bum, bum, bum. Oh no, I think someone's going to die. Or perhaps there should be some light comedy here. So that's the feeling it gives me. And when things are going well, it's just really fun because I am being surprised myself. Some of my friends have the whole book planned out, but I myself can usually only see about half a chapter ahead. And sometimes I'll be typing things late at night and I'll realize, oh, so this is why so-and-so died. I see, and when that happens, it's really wonderful. But when it doesn't happen, it's awful. I mean, it's really awful. There's a lot of rolling and around on the floor and crying and saying things like, who's the fool who wrote this book? And, oh no, it's me. So, it does have its challenges. I wouldn't recommend it.
This audience member asks how often Yangsze Choo finds herself writing.
I try to write 300 words a day. It's not a lot, but I read that that's what Graham Greene did, so I was like, okay, I'll try. Some days it's more, some days it's less. And as I mentioned, sometimes I really get stuck. I'll be very honest with you. For each one of my novels, I've hit a spot in which I feel like I do not know what's going on, like who is the fool who wrote this book? And I've had to set aside for weeks, sometimes months, until you can start again. So it's not a very steady way of making a living.
This question is if Yangsze Choo is working on anything new.
Well, I am working on another novel, and it's not going very well, hence all the propagating. It's actually a book about plants. So, I love plants, and everywhere I go, I like to look at the trees and the fauna, and I was looking at that in Minnesota. I thought all the leaves are different. So it's about ginseng, and I actually went to Korea to do some research, look at the ginseng plants, but I have not gone very far with it.
Our next question is about creating timeless characters, especially in historical fiction.
I think one of the issues of writing historical fiction is that one must be historically accurate. At least that's, as a reader myself, I'm always like, no, that's wrong. They didn't have flush toilets in, whatever. So, and when I was writing, I think The Ghost Bride and Night Tiger, it did strike me that in the past, the only time in which a woman could leave the house or go on an adventure was really the bride journey. That is when you can go. And so I actually thought about it for Ghost Bride, like I made her as old as I could to be married off, which was 18. So if I could have made, and I think Night Tiger, she's 20, and it is interesting, but as I mentioned, I myself am a middle-aged woman, and I want to read about a heroine or protagonist who had done different things. And so when I wrote The Foxwife, it was actually very fun to write about a character who has a lot of opinions about everything. So I really enjoyed that. I hope readers do too. But it's sort of having like a story told from a grandmother's point of view, but a granny who can still have adventures. I think that, which brings me to another point about historical fiction, and that is of keeping the world in sort of compliance, or making sure that it's a world that makes sense to the readers. Because I think that as a reader, whenever you read a book, it's like entering a dream, somebody else's dream. And if something happens that shakes that, like, no, that's wrong, there weren't any bicycles in 1750, then the whole dream world is shaken and you kind of wake up. And so that's a bit of a long answer, but that's why I think the first two novels I wrote really had to deal with young women. And for this one, I had to bend reality a little bit to have a few 100-year-old heroine who's a fox.
This Club Book audience member asks what Choo likes to read.
Oh, I read a lot of stuff. I read a lot of, I mentioned P.D. James. She writes mysteries. I like Tana French. And also I've read, growing up, I read a lot of Victorian and Gothic novels because that was all that my library had. In fact, when I wrote The Ghost Bride, I thought of it as a Gothic novel which is actually set in Asia in a large crumbling house full of dead people. So that's very gothic. And I also like to read, but when I'm writing, I mostly read, I'll tell you the book that's on my nightstand right now. It's called 50 Sandwiches. So I like to read cookbooks because so that things don't, I also like Haruki Murakami, Banana Yoshimoto, many others. Yeah.
Our next question is how Yangsze Choo ended up recording her own audiobooks.
Oh, well, how did this happen? It happened because, when I wrote my first novel, I just didn't think it would ever get published. Because I thought no one's going to read this book, which is set in a small Southeast Asian country and about an obscure custom. No one's going to read this book. And after that, and when it got published, my editor had said, and by the way, there will be an audio book. And I did not know there was such a thing as an audiobook. So I thought, so who's going to read it? And they said, well, don't worry, we'll find a voice actor. So most fiction novels are read by voice actors. Non-fiction is more commonly read by authors. And the reason for getting a voice actor is because they're better. They're usually better. And so the Ghost Bride and Night Tiger had a lot of dialect. It had Chinese, several dialects of Chinese, it had Malay as well. And so I was very, very worried because I thought if it's read by someone and they mispronounce it, then my family and friends in Malaysia are just going to kill me. So I asked them, and I thought no one's going to read this book anyway. So I asked my publisher, would you possibly let me audition to read it? And if it's no good, then you can find someone else. And so they asked me, they said, do you have any experience? And I was like, no. And I was like, please just can I audition? So they said, okay, you can. And I happened to be in New York visiting my publisher. And they said, okay, we'll give you a trial. And you can go, and we've booked you some studio. Go to the studio and make a recording. So I went to the studio, and once again they were like, "Oh, you're writing fiction. Normally we don't get many fiction writers, but here you go, give it a try." And it was like you go into. Any of you have seen the show Frasier? Like it's like that. It's like this glass hamster case, and they put you inside with a microphone, and then you read. And so they were like, okay, fine, you can read your book. So I read Ghost Bride, and then I read The Night Tiger, and I read The Foxwife as well. I think once they let me, I just kept going. But I really enjoyed reading the audiobook. I don't know if any of you listen to audiobooks. It is a fun experience. It is actually a surprisingly intense business of recording it, because what they'll usually do is they'll book studio time about a week, and you come in about 8 hours a day and you record. And when the first time this happened, I was very, very worried, because I thought I must not be ill, because it costs money to book studio time and I mustn't waste my publisher's money. So I went and I recorded it, and they do give you lots of tips. For example, when I went in to record it, they said, please don't wear any squeaky clothing. And I was like, what do you mean by squeaky clothing? And they said, the producer said that they had a famous rock star come in to record his memoirs, but he was wearing leather pants and a lot of jewelry. So apparently, like, he was making all these extra noises. Like, they're like, don't wear leather pants. I was like, it's okay. So things like that, it was fun. It is very enjoyable in terms of talking to the engineer, talking to the producer about the book, because a lot of times they will give me feedback. They'll be like, this person's dying, can you make them sound like they're dying? I was like, okay, I'll try. So I had fun recording it. And, I went on book tour for The Foxwife, and at each stop, there's always one or two people who come up and say, oh, it's you, because they get used to your voice. And sometimes people don't realize, oh, you're the author and you read it, because it's not that common. But what's really lovely is people feel like, I kind of know you. You know, you were with me when we went for that 10-kilometer run. And I was like, oh, yes. So I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope to keep on writing and hopefully reading more books in future. Thank you.
This fan inquires if Choo ever participated in any writer workshops during her career.
No, not really. And I actually did not take writing classes as an undergraduate either. So this was sort of a hobby. I would say that with some caveats, in the sense of I always enjoyed writing. And but growing up, I think that I would have to get some sort of job so I could pay off my student loans. So I didn't really think about it as a career path. When I was working, I think I did take 1 or 2 classes, but they were more interesting in the sense of like listening to what other people had to say. But I haven't done a lot of writing courses. Some people do, and they say it's very helpful, you know. But I also want to encourage you, those of you who are writing on your own time, that you do not need to take classes, that you can actually write for yourself. And I actually think the best way to write is to read good books. Read really good writing, and that will inspire you as well.
This question is about how the covers for Choo's books were chosen.
Most writers, your cover is a surprise to you. Like most writers don't actually have any say in their covers unless you are, you know, an extremely well-known or famous writer. And so I was just small potatoes. And so the first time, you know, they showed me the cover, I was like, ooh, is this my cover? It was for Ghost Bride. And I was really taken aback because I was like, oh, I just didn't think it would look like this. But it's nice, but I couldn't tell whether it was a good, I had to ask my literary agent, is this a good cover? Because it's pretty. And she was like, yeah, this is a good cover. And so there's definitely a way in which I think that people in the publishing industry understand covers, that they understand that they have to signal something about the book, because you do literally judge a book by its cover. And I had to tell you that I really love this cover for The Foxwife. This is not the original cover. They actually had a different one, and it actually was actually quite beautiful, but it looked very modern. And so my publisher was really great. They went back and they said, you know, it would be nice if this book says something about the contents and that it looks historical. It gives you the setting that is set in Asia, in a snowy area, and there's a fox on it. So I was really excited about that. So the book cover says a lot. It is often a surprise.
Our next question is about Choo's involvement in Netflix's adaptation of Ghost Bride.
I was actually, you know, the screenplay was written by Netflix. And so what they did was they took the world and the characters and they made a different story. But I was actually very thrilled that Netflix picked it up because I'm a big Netflix fan. Actually, I was in the grocery store, Trader Joe's. I don't know if you have that. Oh, you do? Okay, great. So I was in my local Trader Joe's pushing my shopping cart around when I got a text from my agent saying, by the way, Netflix is interested in, and I was like, give it to them. Tell them they can have it. Yay! And she's like, wait, okay, stop. This is why I have an agent. But so I was really excited about that. I do have other author friends who have been very involved in productions. But I think, like I said, I was super excited. I love Netflix and I love their original series. And so I was like, go ahead. And it is quite different from the novel. You know, I don't know if any of you have read the novel. Oh, you have, and watched the series. Oh, you have, okay, I see. And after it came out, I actually got a lot of fan mail from people who were like, so in the novel, the ghost husband is very unattractive. And so I got a lot of mail, people saying, why is he a hot guy? So it's like, well, that's Hollywood, but yeah. So it was actually a surprise to me as well. I watched it with my family, and at certain points I was like, I don't think this was. Was that? No, it wasn't. It was different. It feels like it has a new and different life. But I did get to go and visit the set. So I went to visit. Netflix said you can come and visit, and so I was like, yes, I want to visit. And I went with, I asked my son, who was 13 at the time, if he would like to come, and he's like, Mommy, I'm in 8th grade and I'm so busy. I can't possibly go with you. And then later on, a few years later, he was like, I don't know why I said that. But I brought my daughter, she was in elementary school, and so we looked. And it was very cool. It was a Netflix production. And I got there and I looked around and I thought, oh, there's a reason why some people are movie stars, because they're just so obviously better looking than normal. You must be a star, and you. So it was very fun. I was very grateful that I got to visit.
This audience member asks if Choo has ever considered writing sequels to any of her books.
Yes, I would love to. And actually, I had a sequel planned out for The Ghost Bride. I wanted to call it The Courts of Hell, because it was going to be a courtroom drama about a murder investigation. And it was just too long, actually. When I began writing novels, I did not understand that there was this thing called a word count. I very ignorantly just thought I just keep writing. All the books seemed really long, and I went around looking at the books in my own house and measuring them with my thumb and going, oh, well, I think I'm okay. So what I discovered is that publishers like about 100,000 words for a novel, and if it's young adult, I think it can be shorter, like middle grade, so 80,000, 40,000, 60,000. But they really don't want you to go too long. So about 120,000 for maybe historical novel or science fiction, fantasy. And The Ghost Bride was already, I think it went to 140, 150, and I had to cut it to 120. So I had planned a second part, The Courts of Hell, that I was not able to write, but I really would like to write in the future. I also planned a sequel for The Night Tiger, and that I was also not able to write, so.
Another question asker wonders what motivates Yangsze Choo to write.
I actually write, I think, for myself. Because if you try to write for an amorphous reader, you'll never make them happy. Or perhaps, what you think the reader wants changes. So I think you should write what you find interesting. What is really, really interesting to you that you can't stop thinking about. And, as I mentioned, my mum has not been super enthusiastic about my choice of subjects, because she was like, first it's about people marrying dead people, and then it's man-eating tigers, and now foxes. So my mother has always been like, why don't you write about happy things? So I shouldn't say this. Actually, I was recently in book tour in Malaysia, and I said this, and I forgot my mother was... My parents live in Malaysia. I was like, oops, I forgot Mommy. But luckily, she's got a pretty good sport. She was like, but anyway, I had to tell her that I thought that all of those things were super interesting. Marrying a dead person, well, that's just terrible, So somebody who turns into a weretiger, ooh, what happened? I think the basis of humanity is all about sitting around a campfire and telling each other terrible, strange and wonderful stories. That's what excites, at least it excites me. And so if you're writing, I encourage you to pursue that. Pursue the story that you can't let go of and that you want to explore further.
Our last question of the night comes from an audience member wondering how Choo connected with her publisher.
Well, it is both daunting but also very straightforward. So when I started writing, as I mentioned, I just never thought I'd get published, but I literally Googled how to submit a novel, and it's all on the internet. Actually, it's very straightforward. And I also had a friend who was submitting, and she also told me, don't go to that website, that's a scam, go to this website. And I think that there are a lot of writers' forums now which will tell you which ones the websites might have changed. But basically, all you need to do is write your book, if you want to sell fiction, you have to finish the whole book. So I met a writer who told me that he had written almost the whole book except the last third, and then he submitted it, and then some agent said, "Can I see the whole book?" And he's like, "Yes, you can." So he said, "Don't do that." They always wanted, and non-fiction you can sell on spec. That is that you can say, "I have a book about dolphins because I'm a dolphin trainer," and then you can sell that. But for fiction, they usually want to see the whole book. So get your book ready, and then you basically write a one-page letter, and then you start sending it out to agents. And that's what I did. In some ways, it's good that I was not very much on forums, because if I had read all the stories, I think I would have thought, oh, this is just impossible. But I came out of the slush pile. The slush pile is what they call unsolicited manuscripts. So it sounds like a creature. I came out of the slush pile, and so did very many of my author friends. We all came out of the slush pile. And there are agents and publishers who are always looking for good and original stories. So it's out there. So I'd like to encourage you, if that's any of you are writing, that go ahead, finish your work. I can't say that enough, because finishing it is hard. I think it's easier to begin things. I think I read somewhere like 60% of America is writing the great American novel. But you have to finish it and then send it out. And good luck. Thank you very much, everyone.
That wraps up our Scott County Library event with Yangsze Choo. Make sure to catch our next podcast with Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones is one of speculative fiction's best-selling authors and beloved for his unique, potent blend of horror and cutting social commentary. The Angel of Indian Lake, the conclusion to his acclaimed The Indian Lake trilogy, hit shelves this year. Visit us online at clubbook.org for details on past and present seasons, sign up for our e-newsletter, check out our calendar, and so much more. Stay up to date with all of our events at our Club Book Facebook page. If you're on Twitter, find us using the handle ClubBookMN. And if you enjoy these free Club Book events and podcasts, remember to share them with your friends. They just may too. Thanks again to all those who make Club Book possible, including Melsa, Library Strategies, and Minnesota's Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Our sponsors include Red Balloon Bookshop, where you can purchase all the books featured in Club Book. Finally, a very special thank you to all the libraries hosting events this season. That's it for Club Book, the coolest club in town. We'll see you at the library.